Will President Trump's Venezuela operation be a success or another lesson in regime change?
Do you realize, Tom, that 18 different times during the Cold War, we knocked off regimes, 18 different times, and not in one single case did we produce a stable liberal democracy at the end of the process. It hardly ever happens.
The threats that Maduro and his regime pose to stability in the Western Hemisphere and to the United States directly, harboring Iranians who are conducting terrorist activities across the hemisphere, and because we are acting at the request of what is the legitimate government, the people who actually won the election in Venezuela, I think we're well within any reasonable person's understanding of what international law requires, as in the case of throwing out Noriega in Panama in 1990.
Hello and welcome to Switzerland, a new program about politics, modern history and international relations. I'm your host, Tom Switzer. Today on the show, John Bolton, former National Security Advisor to President Trump and author of The Room Where It Happened, that was published in 2020. And John Mearsheimer, Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and author of The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, that was published in 2001. Two leading American foreign policy thinkers, two views, Bolton versus Mearsheimer, with me, Tom Switzer. Well, in the past week, Washington has taken out the Venezuelan dictator, Nicolás Maduro, from power. But John Mearsheimer is highly skeptical about the mission.
The idea that the United States military, the United States national security establishment can go into a country that has serious political problems, we can wreck the regime, and then we can rebuild it from the bottom up with the American military? Please.
But first, John Bolton. John, welcome to my new program.
Well, glad to be with you. Good luck with it.
Now, in 2019, you were Trump's national security advisor and you backed Venezuela's opposition in an effort to remove Maduro. And you've since lamented that the first Trump administration's failure to oust him, that was one of its saddest moments. So am I right in thinking that you're now celebrating Trump's mission to dislodge Maduro?
Well, I think it was the right thing to do to extract Maduro. He was clearly the head of the gang running the country and the symbol to the world of what has happened to the people of Venezuela and also the stability of the Western Hemisphere. But removing Maduro alone is not enough. The rest of the regime is still there. And remember, this goes back 30 years now. To the time Hugo Chavez staged a coup against the legitimately elected government of Venezuela. Maduro is Chavez's successor. He steals elections himself quite regularly. This is a hardcore group of people. They've been in power 30 years. They're not going to give it up easily.
Okay, so just to clarify your position then Maduro's cronies are still running the joint. They're running Venezuela, and they don't seem to want to give it up. So do you think then that President Trump is willing to settle for Maduro 2.0?
Well, it's a great surprise to the MAGA supporters of Trump that we've now decapitated a foreign regime. And then on Saturday, the president said, we're going to run Venezuela for a while, something that on Sunday, Marco Rubio ran away from on the Sunday talk show, saying, no, we're just going to talk about policy. But the fact is that by undercutting the legitimate democratic opposition in Venezuela, Trump seems to be suggesting we'll deal with the dictatorship if we can get our way on oil, which undercuts the very legitimacy of our claim to go in and remove Maduro in the first place.
Yeah, well, I mean, the acting president, Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, she has in recent days invited the US to, quote, work together cooperatively. And of course, for his part, Trump boasts that she will do what the US wants, especially with respect to resource access. otherwise expect a second wave of military intervention. Meanwhile, as you say, shelve any plans for a democratic transition. Why can't that strategy work?
Well, I think what the government in Venezuela is doing is playing for time. They're obviously taken by surprise at Maduro's ouster, although there is some theorizing that maybe Delcy Rodriguez collaborated with the U.S. I would be skeptical of that. We don't have facts. We'll have to find out. But I think they are trying to show an openness to negotiate in order to buy time. They need to be sure that they've got their ducks in a row, that the army, the military forces remain loyal, that the colectivos, these gangs of motorcycle riding thugs that they use to intimidate the civilian population, remain loyal. They want to level set with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba to make sure they've got their support. And I think it's just a classic game plan to drag out negotiations in hopes that new options will emerge for them.
But just say, for argument's sake, the new leadership in Caracas works with Washington, ends ties to the drug trafficking, cuts its links with Russia and China, Iran. This is the axis of autocracies. Again, why couldn't that strategy work?
Well, if it would work, yeah, maybe that would be acceptable. But one of the reasons that Maduro is still in power up until Saturday was precisely because the likes of Russia, Cuba, China, and Iran want the regime in place. They may not care about Maduro; he may be expendable, but they want the regime to stay in place because it suits their interests. Just take Russia and Cuba. Venezuela is a good forward operating base for Russia for its activities in the hemisphere. And it's got the advantage, it's not as close to the United States as Cuba is. And Cuba needs Maduro, or it needs the regime in power, because they depend on oil coming from Venezuela. And the Havana regime fears that if Maduro falls, they may fall too. And I hope they're right.
Okay, we'll get to Cuba very soon, John, but just on the perils of regime change, you seem to be optimistic about the process, but couldn't it mean a regime change mean a real danger of a power vacuum or something even more destabilizing?
Well, look, in 2018 and 2019, the opposition worked to fragment the Maduro regime at the top, and they thought they had a number of deals worked out where military leaders would defect and they would be able to take power. That didn't work, but they were ready to assume control of the government. Now, we don't know whether Trump has followed through on that. We don't know whether those contacts were made. But I think that to throw the opposition under the bus means that you're potentially going to engage in transactions that strengthen the hold of the regime in Venezuela. And whether these others will back away, I think is deep speculation.
But John, you're a realist, essentially. You're not a neoconservative, as your media detractors call you. You'd recognize that democracy is not an export commodity. It's essentially a do-it-yourself enterprise that requires special circumstances and conditions. So why are you so keen on a democratic transition in Venezuela?
Well, because I don't think that the Maduro regime, even without Maduro, it is going to give up its ties to the autocracies. I mean, the Minister of Defense's name is Vladimir Padrino. Now, Vladimir is not an ancient Spanish name, and it reflects the background of politics in much of Latin America. China, just to give an example, which wants oil wherever it can get it, looks at Venezuela's oil reserves, 17% of the proven oil reserves worldwide, bigger than Saudi Arabia, bigger than the United States. China currently buys 80% of Venezuela's export of oil. They're not going to want to see that disappear. They want sources that they control. So it's more complicated today, I think, harder to dislodge the foreigners than it was back in 2018-19.
Your critics, John, would say, just look at the history of US involvement in this region. You know, the US occupation of Haiti, for example, I think it was from 1915 to 1934. The Americans had occupied it for 20 years and by most accounts left it in a disgraceful shambles. The Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, this is what the critics would say to you. And they'd say these interventions produce not stable liberal democracies, but authoritarian strongmen. How would you respond to those critics who are warning that we could do the same thing here? Sorry.
Yeah, I think they're short on history. In In Haiti, the country was a shambles when we went in, and it was a shambles when we left, and it was a shambles when Papa Doc Duvalier was running it. It was a shambles when he and his son were overthrown. I'm sad to say it's a shambles today. We didn't cause it. Let's be clear. Nicaragua, maybe we should have stayed longer, and then it wouldn't be ruled by the communist dictator Danny Ortega, who's still in power there today. I mean, it's you have to look at this on a case by case basis. The fact is that what the Maduro regime has done over the past 15 years is given opportunities for adversaries of the U.S. and stability in the hemisphere to come in and use their territory to their advantage. It's sort of like in that sense, the Afghanistan of South America.
Okay, sticking with the critics though, and this is an unlikely critic. This is the UK Daily Telegraph, the British newspaper that you contribute columns quite frequently. Now, they raise serious doubts about this intervention. Let me quote from its editorial, and we put this on the screen, quote, "A war which directly focuses on the resources of a sovereign state in this manner would appear to confirm all the worst suspicions held by nations doing business with Washington." Now, that's the Conservative Telegraph in Washington. Meanwhile, all the usual suspects, John, like the Guardian newspaper in Britain, the New York Times, no surprises here. They're staunch critics of Donald Trump, but they say that the coup is illegal, it's unprovoked, it violates sovereign territorial rights. This is the counter-argument, and all this suggests that might is right and it's return to great powers dominating spheres of influence. And they would all say that what Trump has done here is a marked step away from the rules and norms of the liberal international order. Again, John, your response to the critics.
Well, I'm not defending Donald Trump. I mean, I think he is so transactional. He doesn't have a theory of spheres of influence or anything like that. He sees a deal. They've got oil. I want the oil. He was a big critic of U.S. Efforts to overthrow Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And he would say repeatedly, I was one of the first ones against it. Now, of course, if we could have taken the oil, then I would have been in favor of it. That's how he looks at things. I'm not looking at it that way. I'm looking at it from the perspective we did approach Venezuela in 2018, 2019, which is seeing these threats to stability in the Western Hemisphere, which has a direct impact on the United States, and taking action accordingly. I'm not suggesting that's what Trump is doing. I don't think he understands what I just said, and it's legitimate to criticize Trump, but not the effort to overthrow the regime at the request of the Venezuelan opposition.
Okay, but how would China view the overthrowing of the regime? Won't Xi Jinping just see this raid as vindication for possibly taking over Taiwan?
Well, because I think that the circumstances are completely different. The argument that the Chinese would make is that Taiwan is a sovereign part of China. The people of Taiwan beg to disagree with that, and so the circumstances there, the Chinese do not have the approval of the legitimate government of Taiwan asking them to intervene. It's the Chinese who are threatening the stability of Taiwan, not vice versa.
What about Russia? I mean, the Kremlin and its supporters might say that if the US can use military force to topple regimes in its sphere of influence, then Moscow is justified in playing hardball in Ukraine to protect its sphere of influence.
Well, it's not a question of spheres of influence. And what the Russians are doing is the same thing China's doing with Taiwan. Vladimir Putin fully believes that Ukraine should be part of the Russian Empire again. And he has committed unprovoked aggression against it. That's not nearly the same as what Venezuela has been doing to the United States. Ukraine had no designs against Russia. It wasn't engaging in any activity that threatened Russian security or sovereignty. So, you can use the words. The opponents are using words that have different meanings in different situations, but you can't disguise the facts, which is that Venezuela is not the same as Ukraine or Taiwan.
Okay, what about other countries? I mean, you've got Trump now threatening military strikes against another unpopular anti-Western regime. That, of course, is Iran, the mullahs being your nemesis. Now that he's ousted Maduro, could other countries be next, like Colombia?
Well, he is in full Trump flow here of, as he described it in The Art of the Deal. You say the most outrageous thing you can. and people say, my God, he's going to invade Greenland. And they say, well, what do we do to stop it? And in Trump's deal making, if he says the most outrageous thing and gets 30% of what he asked for, he considers it himself a great coup. I think people should try and keep a grip on things. But I would say if Trump did invade Greenland, it's the end of the NATO alliance. Well, it would be the worst mistake of a president in contemporary history.
Okay, that's Greenland. What about Colombia, though? Because, I mean, Trump has been talking tough about the Colombian president and the drug cartel, even though the Colombians maintain they're not linked with the drug cartel.
Well, I'm not a big fan of the current president of Colombia, but he was democratically elected. The government of Colombia does not threaten the United States. We have important assets there. We have worked with the government against illegal narcotics trafficking, not as effectively with this one as with past ones. And so again, the situations are different. Remember, Trump runs his mouth a lot, and it's important to understand that. I think the case needs to be made that he is in fact undercutting American interest when he does things like that, not advancing them.
Okay, what about Cuba, John? I mean, you were very young in 1961, but you would remember the Bay of Pigs intervention that encouraged basically Fidel Castro to host Soviet nuclear missiles. So how would regime change in Cuba differ from, say, failed efforts to dislodge the communists from Havana?
Well, I don't think the Bay of Pigs provoked Castro to get closer to the Soviet Union. I think he was on a mission to do that really from the beginning. But I think it is fair to say that this troika of tyranny in the Western Hemisphere, the Maduro regime in Venezuela, the post-Castro regime in Cuba, and the Ortegas in Nicaragua are leaning against each other. They're propped up by all of them. The regime in Cuba is extraordinarily unpopular, and in Nicaragua, but they've got the monopoly on power there too. If the regime in Venezuela well and truly falls, which it has not yet, yeah, I think Cuba is in trouble, and I think it's not because of military action by the United States. It will be because of the people in Cuba, not to mention millions of Cuban Americans in Florida who are in daily touch with their friends and relatives in Cuba. And I think hopefully Ortega would be just taking out the remaining trash if he fell.
Okay, now back to Venezuela. Trump does say that the US will run Venezuela during a transition, and American oil companies should control the oil sector. Now, on oil, John, during your National Security Council meetings in the first Trump administration, was the prospect of the US gaining access to Venezuelan oil, was that ever a priority?
Well, it was a priority for Trump, as I mentioned in the case of Iraq. Oil is always a priority. And why? Because he wants to keep the price of gasoline at the pump down. This is a big part of the politics of the U.S. economy that will play out in the November elections coming up. Is inflation still a risk, or is the economy secure? But the idea that somehow that is a legitimate motivating factor on its own is just, it's not part of any national security argument that really is important. There are bigger issues at play.
Yeah, well, I mean, why would he be so focused on oil when, correct me if I'm wrong, hasn't the United States been energy self-reliant for the best part of a decade?
Yeah, but if Venezuelan oil used to come into the United States in great quantities, and we've got a lot of refinery capacity. I mean, I'd love to see a democratic government in Venezuela pumping more oil. The Chavez Maduro regime has destroyed the oil infrastructure. And one reason why Trump's talk about oil is kind of a fantasy is that the infrastructure, the drilling equipment, the piping, storage, transport capacities are so degraded that it will take years and billions of dollars of capital investment before any kind of meaningful fix will take place. So whoever's going to benefit from Venezuelan oil is not going to be Trump. It's going to be the next president.
Okay, and all this comes at a time when so many international lawyers are bleeding about this intervention. Jeffrey Robertson, the Australian prominent international lawyer, he's written a piece in the Sydney Morning Herald this week slamming Trump. This reflects the orthodoxy amongst international lawyers. Isn't it internationally illegal, John, what Trump's done?
No, it's certainly not illegal. And I could go off on what's wrong with international law for a good long while here. But I'll simply say that in this case, the threats that Maduro and his regime pose to stability in the Western Hemisphere and to the United States directly, harboring Iranians who are conducting terrorist activities across the hemisphere, and because we are acting at the request of what is the legitimate government, the people who actually won the election in Venezuela, I think we're well within any reasonable person's understanding of what international law requires, as in the case of throwing out Noriega in Panama in 1990.
Okay, let's conclude where we started, John. I mean, will Trump follow your advice on regime change in Venezuela? It's one thing to take out Maduro, but will he follow it up with regime change? Now, you've closely followed and participated in American conservative debates very closely since Barry Goldwater's Republican nomination in 1964. You're well aware that Trump's MAGA base is cut from a very different cloth from the old Reagan-Bush conservative Republican base. Now, many MAGA folks might ask how this military intervention in Venezuela squares with Trump's past pledges to avoid foreign entanglements, nation building, and regime change. So given all of that, why would Trump follow your advice when it could alienate his MAGA base?
Well, I think he has alienated his MAGA base by grabbing Maduro. It's indication that within the White House, opinions about what to do were going back and forth like this. I think ultimately Marco Rubio prevailed significantly, but not totally. Now, Rubio has the dubious distinction of being, as we now call him, the viceroy of Venezuela. He's got to try and make this mishmash of a policy work. I think it's politically very fraught for Trump. It's almost impossible to imagine getting what Trump wants with the likes of Delcy Rodriguez and the others still in place. If we had held on to the opposition instead of attacking Mrs. Machado, I think our chances would have been better. Now, we'll see what happens in the next 24 hours. This is, after all, the Trump administration.
John, as always, it's wonderful to be with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, you're on Switzerland with me, Tom Switzer, and if you're enjoying our new program, please subscribe for free and click the bell at the bottom of the screen and join our mailing list linked in the description below. And now to John Mearsheimer. Now, John, as I mentioned earlier, has been a professor of political science at the University of Chicago since the early to mid-1980s. And he's the author of several important books, most notably The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. John, always great to see you. Thanks for being on my new program.
Tom, it's great to be here. And let me just wish you a happy new year.
You too. Now, John, I've just been chatting with John Bolton, who defends the removal of Maduro, but he warns that it would be foolish to waste this chance to restore government to the Venezuelan people. In other words, this operation really needs to be about regime change, not just the removal of Maduro. What do you think President Trump is up to?
Well, you want to remember that when President Trump was campaigning for re-election, he promised us that he was getting out of the business of regime change. And of course, once you change regimes, you're then in the business of social engineering. You're in the business of nation building. And President Trump was well aware that we had done that during the unipolar moment and that it had been an abysmal failure. And he said that he was going to reverse that policy and we weren't going to do that again. And for good reason. But here we are trying to do regime change in Venezuela. And the question you have to ask yourself, is this going to work out this time? Number one. And number two, when you think about grand strategy, when you think about all of America's interests around the world, does it make sense for us now to get involved in social engineering, not only in Venezuela, but maybe in Colombia, Mexico, and Nicaragua as well? Because President Trump has been talking in a very ambitious way. He seems to have an expansive agenda of doing nation building in the Western Hemisphere. So my argument is this is probably going to fail. It's highly likely.
But maybe Donald Trump's still not interested in nation building. Is it conceivable, John, that he's just done a deal with Venezuela's vice president that you give the Americans Maduro, and that helps explain the ease of the American mission. I mean, no Americans were killed. You give us Maduro in exchange for the regime being in place and just give us the oil. Is that conceivable?
It's conceivable, but it's not likely, and it's inconsistent with everything the president has said up to this point. He said that we're going to run the place. He was very explicit about that. And he doesn't seem to have much interest in anyone in the present government or anyone in the opposition taking over and running Venezuela. He's going to run it. So it doesn't look to me like this is one of these operations where he goes in and he quickly kidnaps Maduro and lets somebody else in that regime take over. And then we're done with it. He's talking
Okay,
in
so
much more ambitious terms.
your argument then is that this operation makes no sense, but you've also argued, John, through decades of scholarship, that great powers will go to great lengths to defend their vital interests in their sphere of influence. That's your argument, and that in the United States case, the defense of the Western Hemisphere has always been the number one strategic priority for the Americans. So by that logic, isn't Trump's Venezuela operation sound strategy? He's just protecting America's spheres of influence.
No, the Monroe Doctrine, which is what this is all about, says that the United States wants to ensure that no distant great powers form a military alliance with any countries in the Western Hemisphere or move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. Distant great powers are supposed to keep out. That makes eminently good sense. But there is no threat at this moment of any distant great power moving into the Western Hemisphere. This is a classic case of imperialism, right? What Trump doesn't like is the fact that Venezuela stands up to him. And furthermore, he wants Venezuela's oil. So he's going to take over Venezuela. He's going to run it. And he's made it very clear that he's going to take their oil. But there's no threat from Venezuela of any consequence in the Western Hemisphere. And it has nothing to do with the Monroe Doctrine.
But John, Washington says there's evidence to show that not just Russia, but China, Iran, they've been in cahoots with the Maduro regime in Caracas. And this is the so-called axis of US adversaries we all too often hear about. And, you know, the argument here is that if Moscow won't tolerate Western meddling in its sphere of influence, why on earth should America tolerate Russian and Chinese and Iranian influence in their sphere of influence?
I don't know what cahoots means when you say they're in cahoots with the Venezuelans. The fact is that they have good relations, the Venezuelans, with the Russians and the Chinese, and there is economic intercourse among those different countries. There's no question that the Chinese get oil from Venezuela, but that's not inconsistent with the Monroe Doctrine. What the Monroe Doctrine is all about is keeping great powers from forming military alliances in the hemisphere and putting military forces in the hemisphere, much the way the Soviets did during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's verboten. But there's no evidence that that is happening. And I am sure if there was any indication that Venezuela was moving to form a military alliance with either Russia or China, we would land on them like a ton of bricks. And I believe we would be justified in doing that. But what we're talking about here is a situation where Venezuela is not a serious threat to the United States, and it's not a serious threat to the Monroe Doctrine. We just want their oil.
But aren't Russia and China, this is what the administration would say to you, they're moving to secure control over Arctic sea routes and precious minerals, and that could threaten US interests. And moreover, you've often said, John, we've had these discussions many times over the years, that it really doesn't matter what Western Europe and America thinks about Russia when they expand NATO. I mean, the Americans in Brussels will say that NATO expansion is a benign intent. it matters what the Russians think in this game because we've got to be conscious of their strategic sensibilities. Doesn't that same logic apply here? It's what the Americans think, and they don't like it when they see Russia and China having some kind of relationship with Venezuela in its sphere of influence.
Well, let's just first talk about the Arctic, because this gets at a very important point. The United States has serious strategic interests, core vital interests are at stake in Europe, in East Asia with regard to China, in the Middle East, and even in the Arctic at this point in time. What you say about the Arctic is true. Given all the strategic priorities that we face, I ask you, Tom, does it make sense to get into nation building in Latin America at this point in time when you're trying to deal with Russia, when you're trying to deal with China, when you're worried about what's going on up in the Arctic, where both the Russians and the Chinese are very active, and where you're talking about going to war against Iran again, and you're worried about shutting down the conflicts in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria? Just think of the list of important issues that we're dealing with, and then say to yourself, does it make sense to go to war against Venezuela or to get into the business of nation building in Venezuela and other countries in Latin America? In my opinion, this is lunacy.
But if the administration is not bent on regime change in Venezuela, and this is a moving story, it's hard to know for sure what exactly is happening. But given that Trump's instincts are not to support nation building, and he may not even support regime change in Venezuela, is it conceivable he maybe has done a deal with the vice president and said, you give us Maduro, and that helps explain the ease of the American mission. You give us Maduro, we'll take the oil, but we'll keep the regime in place. I mean, again, that can't be ruled out, John.
I didn't rule it out when you asked the question before, and I would rule it out now. I've pointed out that if you look at the number of times Trump has used military force up until this incursion into Venezuela, you can count 7 instances where he's used military force against other countries. 7 instances. That's quite remarkable. But every one of them has been a pinprick. He is very careful. This is consistent with what you're saying, Tom. He's very careful not to get deeply involved in a forever war or in nation building. Now, the question is, will this operation be a pinprick operation, which is what you're basically saying, or will it be a much more serious endeavor, which I'm saying appears, and I want to underline that word, appears to be the case simply because of the way Trump is talking?
What about, just getting back to the issue of taking out Maduro, hasn't he and his wife and his cronies been running a criminal organization out of Caracas that traffics in humans, drugs, weapons, all that corruption and criminality? And from Washington's perspective, this can't be tolerated.
Well, there are lots of leaders around the world who are dictators and behave in brutal fashion. And the question you want to ask yourself is, do you think you should be in the business of toppling those regimes and going in there and putting a regime in place that doesn't do those nasty things? I thought we learned during the unipolar moment that this is a fool's errand, and this is the sort of thing you want to avoid. There may be certain circumstances where the threat is so great of the sort that you're describing that you have no choice but to do it. But I looked at the charges against Maduro that have been filed, and I think they're going to actually have a tough time nailing him in the court system. I don't think he's anywhere near as tied to these drug cartels as proponents of this operation.
So you don't think this is analogous then to the mission to dislodge Noriega from Panama in late '89, early 1990?
No, I don't, and I wasn't in favor of that one either.
Mm.
I'm interested mainly in the balance of power among great powers. The serious threats that we should worry about are countries like the Soviet Union, countries like China, and of course Russia as well, although Russia is nowhere near as threatening as China is. But this idea of running around the world and interfering in the politics of minor powers that you tell a story
Yeah.
to yourself about how threatening they are is just a prescription for unending trouble. The thing you want to remember, Tom, and all viewers should remember this, is the most powerful political ideology on the planet is nationalism. And nationalism is all about sovereignty and self-determination. And no Venezuelan wants the United States coming into their country and telling them what their politics should look like, much less kidnapping their president. The United States goes ballistic when people say that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election. This is unacceptable to the United States. We're a sovereign state. Well, as you know, Tom, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And
But
if we think sovereignty is good for us, don't you think that other countries around the world, including minor powers like Venezuela, are going to want to protect their sovereignty? They're not going to want the United States coming in and running their politics.
what about the democratic will of the Venezuelan people themselves? Remember, in the 2024 presidential election, John, they voted decisively by most accounts, 70 to 30% in favor of the democratic opposition. Maduro refused to relinquish power to the opposition candidate. And of course, that candidate's freedom fighting colleague, Maria Corina Machado, she won the Nobel Peace Prize just a few weeks ago. And every credible poll has suggested that support for removing the dictator, that's only grown in Venezuela. So isn't there I mean, you're talking about nationalism and sovereignty. Isn't there a democratic case for toppling Maduro?
Yeah, a democratic case for the Venezuelan people to topple Maduro. Maduro's their problem, not our problem, right? Let them solve the problem. I regret the fact that there's not democracy in Venezuela. If I could snap my fingers and make democracy appear in Venezuela, I'd do that. I think it's all for the good, obviously. I love the fact that I live in a liberal democracy. But I don't want to get in the business of sending the United States military into countries like this, like Venezuela, for the purposes of doing social engineering, for rectifying legitimate problems that those countries face. I don't dispute everything you said, but my point is it's up to the Venezuelan people to fix the problem,
Up
not
to the Yeah, I get that, up to the Venezuelan people, but you would be aware that since Maduro assumed power in 2013 when he replaced Chavez, I think roughly 8 million Venezuelans, and that's around a quarter of the country, John, they have fled, and that has just triggered a humanitarian crisis across the Americas. And that's why they're celebrating that Maduro is no longer the leader of Venezuela.
I don't dispute that. But what does that mean? That we're supposed to go in, topple the regime, rebuild, rebuild Venezuela so that it's a peaceful democracy? Do you realize, Tom, that 18 different times during the Cold War, we knocked off regimes, 18 different times, and not in one single case did we produce a stable liberal democracy at the end of the process. It hardly ever happens. The idea that the United States military, the United States national security establishment can go into a country that has serious political problems, we can wreck the regime, and then we can rebuild it from the bottom up with the American military? Please.
What about the case we mentioned earlier, John, in 1989, 1990, with the removal of Noriega from Panama? Now, he spent something like 27 years in a jail in America, but hasn't Panama been more or less a stable liberal democracy ever since?
Not really. Not really. Uh, and as many people have pointed out, Panama is a much smaller country than Venezuela is. And the problems that we faced in Panama were much less than the problems that we would face in Venezuela if we really went in there. People want to remember that we do not have boots on the ground in Venezuela. This gets back to our discussion about a pinprick operation. Trump talks about running the place. My question is, how is he going to run the place? How is he going to do social engineering without boots on the ground? And he says he may put boots on the ground, which contradicts your basic point that he's too smart to do that, and this is a pinprick operation. Let's hope that you're right, that it is a pinprick operation, and he, decides not to engage in social engineering.
But I mean, on social engineering, and notwithstanding all your points as a key leading realist in the West, you've long argued that democracy is not an export commodity. It's essentially a do-it-yourself enterprise that requires very special circumstances and conditions. It's got to come from within the country itself. I get all of that. But on the theme of democracy, let me put to you an extract from the Wall Street Journal editorial immediately after the removal of Maduro. Here's the quote. This is the Wall Street Journal. The president owes George W. Bush an apology for his ex post facto criticism of U.S. intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan. Mr. Trump is pursuing the Bush freedom agenda, at least in the Western Hemisphere. Are we all neocons? Now, that's the Wall Street Journal editorial immediately after the removal of Maduro. John.
What is the Wall Street Journal saying? That Trump owes Bush an apology because it turns out that Iraq and Afghanistan were not disasters? That what has just happened in Venezuela shows that Afghanistan and Iraq were not disasters? What world are these people living in? Afghanistan and Iraq were disasters. If Trump criticized Bush, he was right on the money. The United States should have never gone into Iraq. And when it went into Afghanistan and knocked off the Taliban, it then should have gotten out of town as quickly as possible and not returned. You want to remember, after 20 years in Afghanistan, we left with our tail between our legs.
Yeah,
we left
neoconservative. I think the Wall Street Journal editorial page and the neoconservatives who make those types of arguments, John, they would say that conceptually the ideas to invade and occupy both Iraq and Afghanistan was sound. It's just it wasn't executed very well. I think that's what their argument would be, to be fair to them.
Well, the fact is we lost in Afghanistan and in Iraq, as a number of people predicted. And the idea that there was a way to do this correctly and we just didn't see it, they weren't saying that at the time. When we went in there and we appeared to be successful in the initial stages of those conflicts, they were leading the cheers. They weren't saying we're not doing it correctly. It was only after everything went south in first Afghanistan and then Iraq that they started saying, we just didn't do it right. If we had just followed the correct formula, we would have lived happily ever after. As the historical record makes clear, there is no correct formula for doing these things. They invariably turn into failures. And again, the Wall Street Journal and Afghanistan, the Wall Street Journal is wrong on Iraq and Afghanistan. But let me just say a word or two about Venezuela. We're in a similar situation here. It just happened, and it looks like Trump has pulled off a great triumph. No American casualties. We went in, we pulled Maduro out, and he's patting himself on the back, and everybody's saying, rah, rah, rah. That's today, but let's see what this situation looks like in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. You remember when George Bush landed on the aircraft carrier and said, mission accomplished. I think you have to be very, very wary when you get into the business of nation building.
And that's why let's conclude by returning to the issue we started with about what's now, what's likely to happen. I mean, as we discussed, we can't rule out the prospect that Trump never commits troops to Venezuela. He just does a deal with their regime that in exchange for Maduro and Venezuela's oil, they keep the regime in place. But he does talk about the US running the country. How long do you think he would run the country before there is any transition, if there is a transition?
Well, it just seems to me it's hard to run the country without being present.
Mm,
Uh, I mean, how do you run the country from afar? I get the sense from listening to people in the administration talk that they plan to use economic leverage. They plan to coerce the Venezuelans who are in charge with economic threats. I don't think that's sufficient. I think you need boots on the ground. You have to get in there and get your hands dirty. Second point, Tom, is okay, we're going to run it for a while, but who's going to then run it? Who are we going to turn it over to?
mm,
Uh, the opposition, there doesn't seem to be anybody in the opposition that the administration is attracted to. To my amazement, President Trump has dissed Machado, this woman who won the Nobel
mm,
Prize,
mm,
who
mm,
I think most people thought
mm.
we would go to great lengths to install as the replacement for Maduro. But he has nothing good to say about Machado. And if he doesn't get rid of the existing regime, he simply takes away Maduro and leaves the regime in place. What kind of change is that? Doesn't look like
Yeah,
regime
but,
change.
but but John, could you, from Trump's perspective, run the country, so to speak, by just making Venezuela a client state? It's happened before in history.
What does it mean to make it a client state? I mean, I'm not sure what that means.
Well, you just make them conform to America's expectations on a wide range of issues, such as controlling the oil.
That didn't work in Iraq. It didn't work in Afghanistan.
Mm,
It didn't work in Libya. I mean, we have a rich history of trying to push states around.
mm,
And then when they don't obey us, going in and toppling the regime and trying to put in place a democratic regime that's stable and friendly to the United States. And it hardly ever works. I mean, look at the track record here. And by the way, as I said before, Trump has understood this for a long, long time.
mm, mm.
He opposed the Afghanistan and Iraq war, they say. He campaigned on the grounds that he wasn't going to get in the business of doing regime change and then nation building. And this appears to be a real departure from that. And you just scratch your head and say, why is he doing this? Because again, the United States has so many pressing problems around the world that are more important than doing social engineering in Latin America that you can't understand, or at least I can't understand why he would countenance doing this.
Well, that's it, though. I mean, if he does indeed support genuine regime change and nation building in Venezuela, to the extent that's right, John, to what extent will this damage his branding with the MAGA Republican base that has supported his instincts not to start wars and not to do precisely the very nation building and regime change that you think he wants to do now in Venezuela?
Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was once a fervent supporter of his, has castigated him on exactly these grounds.
Mm.
And there's all sorts of evidence that there are people in the movement who are very upset about this. But I think most people in the MAGA movement are holding their fire for the reasons that you were alluding to earlier when you said that this probably will be a pinprick operation and that he'll work out a deal that doesn't require us to get deeply involved in Venezuela and certainly not deeply involved in nation building. And therefore, they can stay President Trump. My point to you would be that may happen. But if it doesn't happen, and the more likely outcome, I think, is that we will get involved, uh, then the MAGA base, I think, will begin to revolt. There's no question that the MAGA base is very upset with him on foreign policy issues because he was going to be an America First president. He was going to focus on the home front. He was going to make America great again. And he was going to diminish the importance of foreign policy. But what's happened here is he's expanded our foreign policy agenda in ways that nobody anticipated. You want to remember, it was only a week or so ago that he was bombing Nigeria. And not only he's bombing Nigeria, he's bombing Somalia. He's bombed Iraq. He's bombed Syria.
Yeah, but he's doing all this without the nation building, though, as we discussed.
Yes, that's true. But the point is that the agenda here is much broader than the MAGA base wanted. The MAGA base wants him to concentrate on fixing the problems inside the United States. They don't want an expansive foreign policy. And you're right that he's been able to get away with it because he's been pursuing pinprick operations. And by the way, just think about Iran. He attacked Iran, and that lasted one day. On June 22nd of the past year, that's 2025, he blasted a number of sites in Iran, and then he declared victory and said, that's it. And that's been basically his modus operandi. But the question on the table between you and me here is whether or not that will change now with Venezuela.
And on the MAGA Republican base and Trump and US foreign policy, John, next week, you and I will address the US-China security competition with a prominent Singaporean former diplomat and academic Kishore Mahbubani. Till then, it's always great to be with you, John. Thanks so much.
It's my pleasure, Tom, as always.
And remember, next week, we'll have John Mearsheimer back on the program with the Singaporean diplomat and academic Kishore Mahbubani. We'll be talking about the US-China security competition.